no public forum for discussion, the press has got an increased responsibility. And the government and the group of journalists have not come to an understanding on this issue. So there is so much pressure to get so much done in such a short time that people in government tend to lose patience with journalists who, standing, so to speak, in the coolness of the corridors, are not very much aware of the heat in the kitchen. And therefore, people in power tend to be impatient of such criticism. Said if they were here and appreciated our difficulties, they would minimize their criticisms a little. But of course, what they realize, what they fail to realize, is that where a newspaper points out the weaknesses of the government, it is contributing to what they call the revolution. It is said, and there is evidence for this, that when in 1966 President Nkrumah was overthrown and sought refuge in Guinea, he started by broadcasting frequently to Ghana, and then he gave up. And in most of his broadcasts, he made the point that the difficulties which were unearthed after his overthrow, the shortages, the repression, etc., came to his notice only after his overthrow. That when he was in power, nobody was telling him anything. And to a large extent, this was true. He had established some halo around him. And newspapers, people on the radio never wanted to say anything which displeased him. Therefore, he only heard what he wanted to hear. So that even if he had been ready, willing, or able to do something about the shortcomings of his regime, he wasn't given this type of information. This was a situation he had created himself. But he recognized his folly only when it was too late. And our governments have a lot of difficulty recognizing that it is in their own interest to know what is happening on the other side. Now, this is the situation of the press in Africa now. Now, the question to ask ourselves is it likely to remain this way? Or is there any way in which, while the press is playing its role in the society, the pressures on it can be minimized? What, in effect, are the alternatives? The continuance of the status quo is undesirable for the obvious reasons. Some people, like Professor Hackton of Wisconsin, have suggested that actually a certain amount of private foreign investment in partnership with indigenous entrepreneurs could establish some independent press which would perform the role the newspaper is expected to play in the society. This sounds good on paper, but from my personal experience, I think it is most unadvisable. Most unadvisable because there is, as long as there is foreign participation in any newspaper or mass media enterprise, there is going to be a perpetual suspicion that those who write on it have got motives and that they are taking instructions from their stockholders abroad or something like that. Remember, whenever we got into trouble with the government supporters, the Living Observer, the government supporters usually said, oh, they are being financed from outside. And when we challenged them, nobody could give any evidence. But if they had had any evidence that we had received a cent from anybody outside, that would have been the surest way in which to shake our credibility. Therefore, I think the question of foreign participation must be ruled out. I do not think it's a viable alternative. Then there is also a suggestion that the present newspaper presses should be sold to indigenous businessmen. Perhaps this can be done in Nigeria, which has got a lot of oil money and which has recently increased salaries by an average of 130%, backdated from April last year. Perhaps they may be able to do this, but I can't conceive of any other African country in which you have individuals who have so much money to buy these presses and come out with decent publications. For one thing, to most of the, at least from the Ghana experience, most of the people who have money are crooks. They happen to have been in politics and they got 10% from contracts and did all sorts of things. And they are such crooks that a lot of people shudder to think that they might get a very important weapon at their disposal. So I think that alternative too is out. At any rate, it is also most likely that no government which has a control over the press now would be willing to sell it to anybody for anything. The alternative which appeals to me is that of a sort of compromise. This idea has been tossed about a few times. That is the idea of a press trust. That is to say, basically, the government will retain ownership of the press, but its control will not be directly exercised by the government, but by a public trust, or as a modification of the system under which the BBC operates. Something which goes along these lines. You have the government owning the newspapers and then having a representative body of the community which will form a trust and which will be responsible for hiring editors, disciplining them where necessary. But a lot will depend on the composition of this trust. If it is packed by government nominees, the situation would not have changed. But supposing we have a situation in which the government has nominees, and then in addition, you have certain identifiable bodies in the society, like the Farmers' Council, the Trades Union Congress, the universities, the Bar Association, the judiciary, and such organizations, all electing their own representatives without any outside interference. You put them on a board which is responsible for the management of the newspapers. If an editor writes something which displeases a particular member of the government or even the whole government, you need to get all these members of the trust to agree before he's dismissed or something. And hopefully, if the board is well composed, it will reflect such a broad spectrum of opinion that if extreme disciplinary action should be taken against a journalist, it is going to be on a very, very important issue. It is not going to depend on the caprices of any individual, but if you have a properly constituted board and fairly representative, and people who have not been pushed in by the government will have its representatives too, who have not been pushed in by the government but representing organizations, I think this is not the most satisfactory situation. But it will definitely give pressmen a certain self-confidence, a certain security, and it will all be for the good of the press in Africa. If such a proposal is put to any government, I think unless they are very unscrupulous, they will find it very difficult to give reasons why this cannot be done or should not be done. All the government is, we do not support the creation of this trust. It means they want to have a grip on the press, and everybody will suspect the motives. And even when military people have seized power in Africa, they have always started by saying that the previous government had not respected individual liberties and they had come to restore it. Therefore, such a suggestion, I think, must be tried out. So far, the journalists have taken an extremist position, talked about the libertarian tradition, which is not applicable to Africa as far as I'm concerned. And the government has taken another position where the newspapers should be nothing but transmission belts and tools to be used by the government after its own fashion. But I think if you are looking for something attainable, you must start on the basis of realism. The objective fact is that the government own the presses, they are not going to give it up. Therefore, how do you make the best of a bad job? How can you salvage anything out of this situation? I think, of course, more details to work out in this press trust idea, but I think if it is considered, it will help send back the African press to the period where it had a certain amount of dynamism. I will conclude by saying that Africa is going through a period of experimentation. It is trying to adopt foreign institutions and systems, not for the purposes of implanting them wholesale, but when these are adopted, they want to adapt them to their own situation. The social and economic and political circumstances of Africa are different from those in other parts, and therefore, even though the modern mass media, as we know, are foreign to our way of life, if we have adopted these, we need to adapt them to our own situation. The experiments so far have not been particularly brilliant and do not necessarily give room for much optimism. But despite all the difficulties, the resilience of certain individual pressmen, like the pressmen of Nigeria, individual pressmen, the press in Liberia is at the moment having problems with the government, because the press there is, the government appears rather puritanical, almost the kind of thing they have in Wisconsin. Lottery is not permitted in the country. And a newspaper which is very critical of the government is in trouble now because they published football pool results from Britain and felt that it was wrong. And you can give a dog a bad name and hang it. And that paper is being handled by students, and they have been fined about $70,000. And they cannot pay, and therefore they cannot come out with this type of thing. But the resilience and the courage of individual newspapermen in Africa shows us that despite all the difficulties, if people have the courage and are prepared to make certain sacrifices, it is likely that the newspaper will rise from the near abyss where it has almost fallen and get back to something near the heights where it got to in the pre-independence period. Thank you very much.
Some of you may have some questions that you would like to address to Mr. Ansah, and what we will do is perhaps for about 15 minutes or so, 10 or 15 minutes. And then we can retire to the Black Cultural Center where we will have a reception for Mr. Ansah, okay?
Yeah, but the military governor was not unaware of this. And when the court gave a ruling, they gave the ruling against him and his aide when Amakiri was awarded costs and awarded damages. It was against DT Spiff and his aide because the military governor was not, see, he wanted to have a grip on the papers and he complained bitterly that this information had come out coinciding with his birthday. At any rate, if the press reports wrongly, what is the punishment? See, the problem people are facing in Africa is that people do not seem to be operating according to rules. Many newspapermen, if they do anything against any of the laws, even the stringent laws governing the press, if people are prepared to play the rules according to the games, that this is seditious, they take you to court and you argue. For example, we have a lawyer.
And because we've had a contempt case before, he goes through every script because we know people are out trying to get at us. They look at every script from the purely legal point of view. Matters of taste and editorial policy, please leave that to us. And he does this, and we are told that once the lawyer signs with his green ink, in case you are involved in libel or contempt, it constitutes an extenuating circumstance. It shows that at least you took reasonable care to ensure that what you are bringing was not libelous or contemptuous or seditious. But if people will operate according to the rules, but if you write anything, and then some military officer or politician can order that at 5 a.m. in the morning, people come to take you at gunpoint to some camp or something, that's what makes things difficult. Yeah. Excuse me. I would want to make a remark there. I've spoken already a lot, and I don't want to inflict my voice on you much further. But I think I made a point that the newspaper or the press tradition in the West, which has been adopted in Africa, needs to be adapted to our particular circumstances. That it's not a question of transplanting ideas, but it's a question of adapting them to our own circumstances. And it was in that context that I spoke about experimentation, that we want to find out what type of experimentation, to what extent we can adapt these to our own circumstances. And anybody who does not learn from other people's experience is doing a lot of harm to himself. About the point of the other Western educated journalists, there are very few African journalists who are Western educated. They have received Western type of education in Africa. And it is not my experience that when they get, some people do, not only journalists, or even not journalists, that people only discuss what American intellectuals do and what they do not do. If I must give a personal note, for example, if you take the Legon Observer, which was supposed to be a highbrow paper, we did not talk about abstract things. We talked, for example, about how to adapt the education we are having to make it more relevant to our needs. When the government wanted to bring a new educational program, the Commissioner for Education sent us a copy of the proposals ahead of time and asked us to get people to do reflections on these, how best we can adapt the educational structure to our own needs. And it's not just a question of people bringing ideas which are irrelevant to Africa. As Chinua Achebe said, the people in government in Africa and many other places behave like people who have been walking in the rain for a long time, who are drenched to the skin. And they get into a room which is well heated, and they are sitting by the fire. And it is not of their own free will that they would want to get out again. Whatever they can do to make them stay by the fire as long as is possible, they will do. And in many cases where newspapers have got into trouble with governments, it is mainly because the governments have identified their own survival with the survival of the society. It's not that they have said something which will jeopardize the society as such, but their own personal interests are involved. Who knows that African leaders do not financially get much better off when they get into power? Now, I admit that the press is not doing well enough, but I do not think that it is mainly because the ideas they write in the papers are irrelevant. At any rate, I do not also believe that a newspaper, for example, is irrelevant in Africa. That we have got a lot of illiterates, things like that. But there is a section of the community which can influence opinion. And a number of governments have shown sensitivity to what the newspapers have said. It is a forum for discussion. And governments have got to know what the people think about how they are ruling through the newspapers. One government paper in Ghana, on one of the very few occasions it went against the government, when the new military government appointed an advisory board. And people felt the people on it were of the older generation. Now they had served colonial governments, they were directors of foreign-owned companies, and should not be on this. There was a lot of hue and cry. A newspaper, a government newspaper, came out with the people's feelings. And 2 days after that advisory committee had been sworn in, it was disbanded. It's a question of the government showing a certain amount of sensitivity to a type of criticism. And I do not think the newspapers are irrelevant to Africa. I do not think so. Excuse me, which African press are you talking about? No, because my experience is different. Yeah. Well, in Ghana, what you are saying is not true. And I am sure that if you knew closely the workings of a newspaper, if you knew the gatekeeping processes, of course, if in Nigeria, as you say, there is a paper which is limited to one tribal group, and everybody on it belongs to that tribal group, then the result you are speaking about can be produced. And Nigeria has a number of papers. For example, at the moment, every state government has one paper, in addition to a few other national papers. But in many other countries, which have national papers, scanning the Times of Zambia, the Liberian Age, the Standard of Kenya, or even the Daily Times of Nigeria, one does not have the impression that they are doing this. Tribalism has been a problem in Nigeria, and I think it is not only the press that you can hold responsible for furthering this, for example. And if any such problem has arisen, and anybody wants to solve it by going to the root, you will have to go to the root and see that the problem may have arisen because of the existence of a tribally oriented paper, not that journalism or journalistic practice favors this type of thing. What I'm saying is that if you look at national papers in Africa, my experience is not that they have been doing this. And in Ghana, if you take any paper and you look at the gatekeeping process, if you look at the reporters and the sub-editors in charge of local news, national news, international news, before it goes right up to the editor, foreign news, etc. If you look at the whole gatekeeping process, unless, of course, you can say that everybody who handles it, every stage of it, belongs to one tribe, then you can say there's a tribal bias. But my experience in Ghana, if you take Fraternité Matin of Ivory Coast or the Soleil of Senegal, in these papers, there is no evidence at all that tribal feelings are whipped up in these papers. Nigeria may have a great problem. In fact, at the moment, I'm writing a paper on looking at a new Nigerian, which belongs to one of the northern states. The new Nigerian, which is a regional paper, but which has a national outlook. what I'm trying to find out is, for example, how much news comes from the region, how much of it is national news. And if you look at the paper, if you didn't know that it belonged to the regional government, see that a certain percentage of the news comes from the region, reporting of local news. But the outlook, if you look at editorials, the outlook is national. Of course, I agree talking about this, that, for example, the kind of local papers we have in America, which is a fairly peculiar tradition, because in many other countries, you have national papers, where you have individual local papers, as in Britain. Everybody might read the paper from the Midlands, but he will read the Guardian or the Times as his normal fare. And then when he wants local news, he takes this type of thing. I recognize that the kind of situation we have in America, where there are very few national papers, if you can call the New York Times, the Washington Post, or Los Angeles Times national paper. If we had too much of that in Africa, there is bound to be a certain amount of fragmentation. But I think you were exaggerating the situation if you think they fund tribalism. And if they do, it is not that the newspapers do, but that the general atmosphere in Nigeria might permit this. Somebody is very impatient and is already up. Well, can I deal with the first one before I forget the train? Well, naturally, if you are writing a newspaper, anybody who is illiterate is out. Anybody who is illiterate is out. And what many governments are doing now in Africa, the radio gears most of its programs towards the rural populations, because a lot of people have radios. In Ghana, for example, the television does it, but I think it doesn't make much sense, because they have got programs for farmers and things like that on television. I say it doesn't make much sense because most of the people to whom these programs are geared do not have television. They don't have electricity to begin with. And television sets are so expensive that only people enjoying a certain salary can buy it. And those are not the best people to benefit from the lessons given by this type of thing. Therefore, if the government really wants to utilize television, they should make it possible for the people who really need the lessons there to use it. There's a very interesting experiment going on in the Ivory Coast where they are using television for what they call animation rural, trying to get the people to learn in groups. It's been going on in the Ivory Coast. There's a similar program in Senegal. There are also, in Liberia and most of the French-speaking countries, newspapers in the local languages. On the point of view of technical production, they are not famous. But in the local languages, which are meant to provide reading material for people who have gone through mass education and literacy campaigns, providing the material to keep up with the reading, and most of the information is relevant to their requirement. When to plant their seeds, when to do this, when to do that. But within the limits I was speaking, I couldn't touch on all these points. So I spoke about the established newspaper written in the official languages, which are addressed to a small section of the population. No, sorry, but this point is interesting, it's useful, but it's not practical. Because most of the people who, when we talk about illiterate in Africa, there are very few of them who read their own languages. Therefore, unless there is a program to teach them how to read, it wouldn't make any sense to do these things. Where governments have had mass literacy programs, then they have papers for, but if you look at the number of people who have been affected by these programs, they are a very small group. This is a problem which should be tackled by the government. Unless the government has tackled the problems, this problem to make people know how to read, even in their own languages, the newspaper man has nothing to do. There's nothing he can do. Why do you publish a paper in Fanti when there are no people to read it? Or if there are only 1,000 people who can read Fanti, if you know the economics of newspaper production, you will see that it is not a practical proposition to print a newspaper for just 1,000 people. Yeah.
Now, if it doesn't do that, because in most cases, our press in Africa, whether it's published in English or French or in Portuguese or in the other language, which is more or less it's geared to foreign readers who may try to exploit any situation, any discontent for their own benefit. Because the majority of the Africans don't benefit from the press.
Yeah, this is quite true, but who should solve that problem? We are not suggesting that it is the duty of the press. Excuse me, we are not suggesting that it is the duty of the press to undertake a mass literacy campaign.
No, what I'm trying to do, if the press is the change to back, I can assure you that the press in Africa is not being effective, not because the rulers are very dictatorial. Because in the West, as traditional press has been taken to Africa, you could see the press here many times, and they have spoken many times and written many times, and they seem to see the same.
Yeah, but if the press gets to a small number of people and therefore virtually has no impact, why are governments so sensitive to what appears in the press? Because if the impact can be ignored, why are governments so sensitive to what appears in the press?
It's the same thing here. Ask the Americans how the government was so sensitive on
No, but it doesn't.
I hate to interrupt you, but I think we better go on to the Black
And then we shall
Cultural Center.
continue from
Yeah,
there.
right. Yeah, we can continue from there. How is that? You can
Yeah.
finish your sentence,
Yeah,
but I
we
think
can.
we should have no more questions because he said.
We will continue from there.